Right, so anyway, we're in chapter 22, and we're going to start in verse 18.
Which one?
Now last time,
Deuteronomy.
Exodus.
Oh, I mean, we're all like kind of out of it today.
And so, probably all kind of giddy from yesterday's football game.
Oh yeah, that was important.
I don't watch football, I watch more motorsport.
That's okay.
We love you anyway.
Anyway, last time we covered a lot of ground. We saw the mind of God reflected in his laws concerning a lot of different legal circumstances, and these laws were intended to provide a guide for this new nation as it evolves from a collection of slaves into a free nation whose purpose is to show Yahweh to the world. And as varied as these laws were, they were not intended to cover every circumstance. So the judges were expected to make a broader application of these laws as the situations arose. So we saw laws dealing with liability issues, such things as animals killing people, animals killing other animals, the grazing of one's animals on somebody else's field, the burning the burning of someone else's crops, theft or damage from a predator or otherwise to someone's property while it was in another's care, or from a rental agreement. And we also saw penalties for theft in general, and the application of restitution, and how the use of an oath before God was applied in some circumstances there. And we saw how the bride price was applied to a pre-betrothal or pre-marriage situation. And the bottom line in all this is that God required his people to live responsibly toward one another. And if there was a failure to do that, the responsible party then was required to pay a penalty for their actions, or their failed to act in a responsible way. And the penalty could be anything from a death penalty to restitution, or even a period of servitude, depending upon the severity of the damage and the person's ability to pay the restitution. So let's, Trevor, can we start with you this morning, and would you read 18 through 20, please?
Okay. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Whoever has sexual intercourse with an animal must be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any gods except the Lord alone is to be set apart for destruction.
Okay, so these next laws are to reflect a people who worship a holy God. And when violated, they make a nation unclean, or some of the reasons. And there's some of the reasons that God's about to bring judgment on the nations in Canaan. And the death penalty is an indication of how serious these things are to God. And the presence of these things in their society kind of tended to draw people away from the worship of their covenant God. And the first one here deals with the sorceress, and in a broad sense, any practice of the magic arts or occult arts. And this involves the thinking that with the aid of a medium or an enchantress, one could gain something apart from God. Okay? Now, these practices led people away from their faith in God and alone, and are condemned throughout both the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible. Now, the next one.
Oh, can I ask something? So
Sure.
is it, I mean, a translation thing, you think, that it wasn't just generally like sorcerer and a sorceress, or is it specific?
I think it probably, I don't know the exact translation. I suspect this is probably accurate.
Maybe they weren't.
Sorceresses were in their oracles, dealing with their oracles. They were almost always dealing with a woman.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yes.
I just, in Uganda, we noted the syncretism of, they came from a place of first the sorcery, looking to get things apart from God, but they then merged it, and especially with like Catholicism and other things, into using a medium to get things from God, which is then the role of the priest fits really well, and
Yeah.
Wendy.
Yeah. All right, the next one, verse 19, is the issue of bestiality or sex with an animal, and you might be tempted to think, now, what is the harm in that? Or maybe you don't think that.
Yeah.
But,
Wicked.
but besides being absolutely gross,
Yeah.
there are other issues involved in this. And this is an example of the kind of perversion that not to be tolerated by a covenant people. And this would be a person who had no regard for godliness. And this practice was also associated with Canaanite fertility rites, which if practiced by the Israelites would represent a replacement and disregard of the natural order of things established by God, and a disregard for his promise to maintain a viable community through their production of offspring. Now, the third, and the last one in this series, verse 20 here, it is an extension of the commandment related to having one God and making and the making and worshiping of idols. And this one deals with the offering and the sacrifice to other gods. And this is obviously targeting polytheism here, or any religion that involves the worship of any god other than Yahweh. And in that world, sacrifice was the equivalent of worship. And according to one commentator, there were no known religions that did not involve sacrifice of some kind in their worship. So God is hereby then forbidding the worship of any other god besides him. And the danger in this violation is in its potential to cause people away from the only true God to gods that don't exist, or at least they don't exist as real gods. Okay? And to the nation, this was not acceptable. God is God, and there is no other. Hence its severity here. Okay, Rick, do you want to read 21 through 24, please?
Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless.
Now this, the next few verses, you'll see the words there like aliens and sojourners, widows, orphans, poor and needy. And these are intended to represent the disadvantaged in a society, those who are more prone to be unprotected and consequently more likely to be mistreated. Now at this point in their history, there was no welfare system. So it was up to the people to make sure that the disadvantaged were not exploited, and God expected them to treat one another fairly and compassionately, because their calling was to be to a higher standard, which reflected God's care for the unprotected. And the first, you're going to see this throughout the entire Bible. Now, the first one mentioned here is the alien, and the alien in most cultures did not have the same rights as citizens. So they didn't have the same protection under the laws of that nation or tribe. But God says, if you mistreat any of the aliens among you, I'm not going to like it very much, and I'm going to do something about it. And to reinforce this, God reminds them of their treatment in Egypt for the past 400 or so years. Now you'd think that having been mistreated in Egypt, they would fully understand and wouldn't even consider treating somebody else that way. But God knows human nature, and he knows the tendency for one to want to turn the tables and find someone else to lord it over. Okay, so he says bad things will happen to you if you do that. He says you're not to act as the pagans in the other nations. And the next one here he mentions are the widows and the orphans, and we often see these two mentioned together. They represent the vulnerable in a society here. Now, women typically had legal protection only through their husbands. So without one, they had very few legal rights, including the right to own property in their own name. Now, if a widow had no family to support her, which could happen, and if she were too old to work, she would have no means of obtaining even the basics. Okay, so, and even if she could work, there was no safeguards against working long hours for next to nothing as a virtual slave. And as for the orphans, if they were young enough and had no extended family support, they were completely at the mercy of others. And they might be forced to work under harsh conditions for whatever someone chose to pay them. You know, maybe just food to survive the day. And if that wasn't available, they could actually starve to death. So God says, if you mistreat these, it will really tick me off. And he says, my wrath will burn. That's pretty strong language here. So he says, not only will I kill you, and that's serious enough, but your own wives and children are going to become the very ones that you mistreated. Now, to kill with the sword here was to indicate warfare. So the meaning here is that God would allow other nations to overpower them. And with the death of their soldiers, then their wives and children would become the ones they had mistreated. So if you want to live and don't want these things to happen to your family, don't do that to others. So it's kind of like the
Traditionally,
principle.
what did they do in the Jewish culture
What's
to
that?
help? Traditionally, what did they do, you know, for the widows and orphans?
Well, it was just
Did they take them into their
almsgiving. They
families,
could.
or-
I don't know. I don't really know, other than
Okay.
that almsgiving was considered a really high virtue in that society.
And
Yeah.
also allowing them to glean,
Yes.
that they were
Oh,
allowed to glean and to
Yeah.
work and get their own, yeah.
Gotcha.
Very good. Yeah.
And families, of course, are responsible to care for their own families, including
Except that they
the,
didn't have them.
including the Redeemer, right, including the
Yeah.
kinsman Redeemer,
Must
Like
have been that
Boaz.
one.
Mhm.
Yeah, so anyway, what we see here, it's kind of like the principle of do unto others.
Mhm.
The other principle is you reap what you sow. So God seems to have very little tolerance for social injustice. Okay, April, would you take 25 through 27, please?
If you lend silver to my people, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a creditor to him. You must not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset. For it is his only covering, it is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen because I am gracious.
So here we see some restrictions on borrowing and lending. This was common practice in most all societies, and these verses here are not a prohibition against these practices. But here we're dealing with the treatment of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable in the society by the money lender. And this would include the poor alien. And there are two restrictions that are placed on the lender in dealing with the poor. The first one is that he's to charge no interest. He's not to profit from the needs of those who have very little ability to repay. And the second one is he needs to use some compassion in his choice of and the use of collateral for the loan. And the broader application of this is that the collateral should not be something that the poor person needs for his or her survival. Now, and again, God says that the disadvantaged cry out to me, I will hear, and God hears. God hears, and God is compassionate. Now, there's a lot of passages in Scripture that deal with this issue of lending and borrowing, and without citing all the verses here, let me just summarize what the Bible says about it. Now, first of all, the Bible does not prohibit lending and borrowing, but there are restrictions. One is not to charge interest to anyone who is poor and needy. And the second, one is not to charge interest to a fellow Israelite. And third, one is allowed to charge interest to a foreigner. And lastly, one is to use wisdom in his or her decisions to borrow. Okay. Now, there you have it. All you ever needed to know about that. Okay. Fran, would you read 28 through 31, please?
You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat any meat which is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs.
Here we have some laws dealing with respect for God's holiness. And the first one is how one addresses God or verbally represents him. Now, in our world today, we might view this as as a violation of our freedom of speech. But that wasn't the case in their world. God's people were not allowed to curse God. It was considered to be hugely disrespectful. The NIV translates this as blasphemy, and that's a pretty legitimate translation there. Now, the Apostle Paul demonstrated his understanding of this when he was being questioned before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 23. After being smacked, he called the high priest a whitewashed tomb and kind of apologized for it, sort of. And this law requires the Israelites to respect God at all times. And it should be a no-brainer. And one's just expected to do this. Okay? And one is expected to show full respect for any legitimate leader of their people, it says. And the word translated ruler or chief refers to any leader with executive authority at any level of society. It's not just their national rulers. Honor is to be shown to all who may warrant it. And this is because any legitimate leader of God's people leads with his authority in God's place as his delegate. And to dishonor them is to dishonor God. Now, the next part of this, respect for God's holiness, is in the area of tithes and firstborn offerings. And these are things that God rightfully owns. They are considered to be due him automatically. And withholding these was considered to be a direct act of defiance because it showed a disregard for his sovereignty and that all things actually belong to him. And God doesn't want the leftovers. He wants and deserves the first fruits. And included in this, the firstborn males of human and animals were God's. But were they expected to be handed over to God as infants? And the answer to that is yes and no. It depended on the species. Animals suitable for sacrifice, that would be lambs, kids, and calves, were to be offered up for actual sacrifice at 8 days. And the firstborn male of other animals, including humans, were to be redeemed or bought back from God by the payment of the redemption price. And one commentator suggests that the reason this is included here is that to neglect or refuse to observe this requirement was to publicly dishonor or display disloyalty to God. This kind of fits into the area of cursing or blaspheming God. Now, the last verse of this chapter shows how the Israelites were expected to reflect their special relationship to Yahweh in their eating habits. And although they could eat the leftovers, that is, animals that were not firstborn offered to God, they could not stoop so low as to eat carrion. This even applied to the animals that were killed by predators. And remember that only animals whose blood had been drained could be eaten. Animals that had been killed in the field would not qualify. There was no eating roadkill. Okay, so now another probable reason for this was people's health. Scavenged meat could have been dead for quite a while and would likely be contaminated, by bacteria, parasites, or whatever else. And this law regarding the eating of unbled animals is repeated 5 times in the Torah, stressing it is important as a covenant principle. All right. Yes.
Not bled, is that you said not bled, or
Right.
which, wow.
Yeah, animals that are unbled could not be eaten. All right. I'm actually going to touch on that a little bit later if we get to it. All right, chapter 23, Fran.
Fair enough,
Just
that's
read.
fine.
Ken.
I don't have my reading glasses.
Oh, okay.
I'm blind.
All right, Derek, you want to take verses 1 through 3?
Okay. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow a multitude in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after the multitude in order to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute.
These chapters start off with an expansion of the 10th commandment. That's bearing false witness. And we're going to see here that these verses also go along with verses 6 through 8. And the issue is preserving justice. Now remember that God wants a people who reflect his character. And the perversion of justice fails to do that. And you'll also remember that the dispensing of proper justice depended greatly on the reliability of the witnesses. The emphasis here is on complete honesty. And so God says there are things that one does not do. And the spreading of false reports is one of those things. And so I'm going to suggest that this refers to one might say about a person prior to a case going before the judges as an attempt to try to influence the case by prejudicing the case in people's minds ahead of time. It's kind of like trying the case in the media. And of course, the only media at that time was the grapevine. And so the spreading of false information could have an effect on the outcome of the case. Okay. Now, not only that, but a false report could result in the arrest of someone who is actually innocent. And then the second issue here is the collaboration with an evil person. So why is that important? Well, because the court system relied so heavily on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So if 2 people could agree falsely, their testimony could result in the conviction of the innocent. Or conversely, it could lead to the acquittal of the guilty. So in either situation, this would be a perversion of justice. Now verse 2 deals with the opinion of the majority. And it says one is not to side with the majority if one believes they are wrong. Now why would one be tempted to side with the majority?
To fit in.
Fit in? You know, to avoid looking foolish? To be
Threatened.
threatened?
Material gain.
Maybe material gain, yeah. You don't want to be considered to be odd. Yeah, it's taking a position that is different from most others. And this principle here calls upon God's willingness to think and act as individuals, not to be swayed by the majority. That's to be willing to stand alone if necessary and uphold what is right so that true justice can be served. And we all know that the majority doesn't always mean right. Now, the next provision says that not only will you not fall in with the many, you're not to show favoritism to the poor in the lawsuit. Now, I think there's a tendency for many people to side with the more well-to-do in the courts, but you're not only not to do that, but you're not to do the opposite either, and that's to side with the poor just because they're poor. And one is not to show favoritism to anyone in one's testimony, not the rich, not the majority, not the poor. Right? And God will have more to say about that here in a little bit. So, Andy, do you want to read verses 4 and 5?
Don't read it in King James.
Right. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall meet it back. You shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him.
All right, so reading this, it's possible to think about this in 2 different ways here. Now, one might think this is about the plight of the poor beast of burden. And the gist of it would be that it doesn't matter to the poor donkey who his master is. The right thing to do is return that wayward donkey before it becomes a lunch for some wolf, or to help him relieve him of some of his burden. And there's no argument there. That would be the right thing to do. And the other is that it is desirable in God's eyes to love one's neighbor as oneself, even if that neighbor is an enemy, or even if he just doesn't like you very much. Now, one might be reminded here of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. Do unto others, not just the ones you think deserve it. Now, it's interesting that God parallels your enemy with one who hates you, and I think this is deliberate here. It's one thing to hate someone, but quite another to deal with the one who you know hates you. And in my mind, it'd be a lot easier to show compassion to those we don't like than to show compassion to those we know hate us. It's also interesting that this expectation is kind of sandwiched in between two passages that focus on one's truthful testimony in legal matters. He says, and I just want to quote what one commentator says about this. He says, God in effect said to his people, in the midst of giving you laws about lawsuit behavior, I want to insert a reminder that I expect you to truly love your neighbor in every situation, no matter how your selfish inclinations might cause you to feel. Okay, that's better than I could have said it. Now, the last thing I have about this situation is in the very last part of verse 5. It says, you shall rescue it with him. And this law requires one to go beyond just being civil to the enemy, to actually being cooperative with him in the solution of his problem. It's to be willing to swallow whatever animosity one might have toward that other person, to work together with them to help relieve them of their problem. Okay. All right, Karina, do you want to read 6 to 9, please?
You shall not pervert the justice of the poor in his cause. Keep yourself far from a false matter. The innocent and the righteous do not slay. I will not justify the wicked. Do not take a gift or a bribe, for the bribe blinds the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, do not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger, because you remember you were strangers in the land of Egypt.
So we're going to see, we've seen how important to God is the serving of true justice is in the people's court. So now he's going to add a little bit more to this. Now the first part reemphasizes the principle that justice should be dispersed equally to all economic levels of society. The poor here should not have a disadvantage in the legal system, okay, which they might have if they are not able to afford the resources to ensure fairness. And the poor would also not have the influence of a more wealthy person might have. Now, next is the admonition to be very careful as one can be in a capital case. No false accusations or false testimony. God is very serious about this. Now he says if someone's lies result in the death of the innocent, sooner or later that person will pay for what he or she has done. And they will not go free from God's justice. And this is intended to put the fear of God into his people. We talked about that last time. Now the next one deals with bribes. We know that there is little people won't do if the financial reward is big enough. And the analogy here is that the power of the bribe is compared to blindness. If the reward is great enough, it can even blind the clear-sighted, it says. But bribery subverts the right way of doing things. It is a perversion of justice. Okay? Now, the language here does not limit this to the court system. It could apply to any situation where a bribe results in a person subverting what is right. Okay. Now, we've got Andy and Karina here, and they've dealt with this repeatedly in Uganda. They have a lot of stories about this. In order to get anything done, they've often had to deal with a series of people. Any one of whom could delay things or bring it to a halt unless the proper bribe is and anyway, this last one, it does not say it involves a legal system, but it could. And this is kind of a repetition of what it says in 22:21. And repetition, remember, is emphasis. One is not to oppress the sojourner or alien. The alien was a non-Israelite. And God here is appealing to their natural sympathy, or what should be natural sympathy for the alien, given their history. Now, to expand on this, God possibly wants to keep them from the other natural tendency, which would be to be partial to those who are most like us, and to discriminate against those who are different. And to counter this, God tells them to remember what it was like. And it literally says, you know the spirit of the alien. So God says, don't do that to others. Okay, David, you ready to read, buddy? I read 10 through 12, please.
Okay. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what they leave. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the slave born in your household, the alien as well, may be refreshed.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the laws given in the book of Exodus, and a reminder here that according to one commentator, the laws of our country are a reflection of the laws of the Torah. Okay, now, in both, there is civil law, criminal law, and constitutional law. We've talked about this before. And we'll find civil law primarily in Exodus and Numbers, criminal law in Leviticus, and constitutional law in Deuteronomy. I think this is a generality, and I don't think it applies everywhere in the Torah, but it's a pretty reasonable generality. And so what we're about to finish are some of the civil laws of the Torah, how the people in this new nation are to live together civilly. And these last laws here deal with the Sabbath and with festivals. So first, let's deal with verse 12. This is a restatement of the 4th commandment, and that is to keep the Sabbath. And what is the one thing that is required of people to keep the Sabbath? The one thing. Don't do what?
Work.
Don't do work. Yeah. Don't do any work. And the purpose of this here is rest and refreshment, and to reestablish one's focus. Okay, this is applied to yourself, your family, your servants, the alien, and even to your animals. It pretty much means everyone and everything who would normally have to perform some sort of daily labor. And this is to be observed every 7th day. Now, as for verses 10 through 11, we have an expansion of this commandment here. Every 7th year, one is to let their fields rest, and they're not to harvest their grapes or their olives. And 2 reasons are given for this. One is to allow the fields to lie fallow and replenish. Now, every farmer knows that you can't just continually pull nutrients out of the soil. The soil will become depleted. Thus, the 7th year. Now, the second reason is to allow, as Karina mentioned earlier, was to allow the poor to gather a harvest. Now, the vines and the trees are going to produce something even if they're not tended. And so whatever is produced is reserved for the poor. The farmer is not to harvest that year. He's going to be required to store up for the down year he knows is coming. Okay. Now, you might wonder how, if the farmer doesn't plant his field, will the poor be able to glean anything? So now, does anybody here have a garden besides Candy? You guys have one, okay? Yeah. Now, do you ever get volunteer crops from the year before? Yeah, you do, right? So something's going to grow even if you don't plant it. And that's what happens.
Hybrid crops.
Okay? And whatever the poor don't glean, the beasts of the field, meaning wild animals, can eat. And of course, the domestic animals also get a pretty nice break from their labor during this year. Now, keep in mind that this law does not prevent the farmer from employing additional crop rotations and fallow land use. It only requires a 7th year sabbatical. He can do that any years extra that he wants to. Now, notice too that the 50th year Jubilee is not mentioned here, but it is going to come up in Leviticus and Numbers. And so they will have a 7-day Sabbath, a 7-year Sabbath, and a 50th year Sabbath. Now, you know that down the road, the nation of Israel will be sent into captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And one of the main reasons for that was their idolatry. What was the other main reason?
They didn't keep this law.
They didn't
The
keep
seventh
the
year.
Sabbaths, did they? No. So what was the significance of the 70 years?
It was a Sabbath for the 490 years.
Yeah, to make up for the missing Sabbaths, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess God was pretty serious about that. And he tells them this ahead of time in verse 13. He says, pay attention to all I have said to you. And his words here demand complete obedience to every part of the law. One would conclude then that there isn't any part of this that is unimportant to God. And the further comment in this verse about other gods is not an add-on. It directly relates here. God knows that the worst enemy of obedience to his words will come from idolatry. One isn't even to talk about other gods, let alone follow or worship them, because they will turn God's people away from his laws to their detriment. And Israel is going to experience this firsthand. Okay, I think we've got time for the next piece here. Jonathan, got a big chunk for you here. You want to read 14 through 17?
Sure. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the feast of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord.
Here we see the formal introduction of 3 required feasts, feasts in which all males are to appear before God. In the wilderness, and I assume that would mean before the tabernacle, but it could have been intended for later when they took control of the promised land. I don't know. But the first here is a reaffirmation of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that first appeared in chapter 12 and again in chapter 13. And the purpose of this feast is to memorialize an important event in their history. Now, what was that event? Passover, right, it was Passover. Now, it was intended to preserve the memory of this event and the message of this event throughout their generations, and it still does even after all of these years. So what time of year was this to take place? What time of year is Passover?
Month of Abib.
Okay, yes, and what time of year is that?
Spring.
Spring, yeah, it's early spring. So, and this also corresponded to the barley harvest. And this is also to be considered the first month in their calendar year. And this celebration was to last for 7 days from the 14th to the 21st of that month. Now, other provisions for this feast, there was to be no eating of leavened bread made with yeast. And remember that they had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, so they could not have had time to allow their bread to rise. And also, on the first day of the feast, there was to be a holy assembly, and no work other than food preparation was allowed on that day. Now, the provision that none were appeared before the Lord empty-handed implies that this feast was to include some form of offering to the Lord. Now, the next feast required of them was to be the Feast of Harvest, and the timing of this one was to be in the late spring or early summer. This also coincided with the wheat harvest, and this feast had other names besides the Feast of the Harvest. It was called the Feast of Weeks, or in the New Testament is referred to as Pentecost. Now, what was the reason for this? Why was it called the Feast of Weeks? because it occurred
7 weeks.
7 weeks after.
Passover.
Passover.
Very good, okay? Now, specified number of weeks following the Passover, that's 7. But, you know, when the Greek became the language of the day, as in New Testament times, it was called Pentecost, being 50th day. Okay? So, now what was the significance of 7 weeks or 50 days? What's the significance of that? Why were they celebrating that?
7 sevens, right? With the-
7 sevens, okay? But there was a significance to that. What happened 50 days after the Pentecost, according to their reckoning?
Giving the law?
Like giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Right, very good. This feast was also to be accompanied by various sacrifices. Now, the third required feast was to be the Feast of Ingathering. This one was celebrated in the fall, following the harvest of other crops like grapes and olives. It could also be following the harvest of a second grain crop. And this one, name for this one is the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot, which means huts or booths. And this feast was immediately followed by the 5 days of atonement, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And these 5 days, the Israelites were expected to live in temporary field huts or booths, and this was to serve as a reminder of the time that they spent in the wilderness in temporary housing. Now, in time, this festival became an alternative beginning of their calendar year. And there were several reasons for the importance of these feasts. And one is that they were to be a reminder to them of certain important events in their history, and to serve as a reminder of how God was directly involved in these events. God was to be the focus of these feasts. And these feasts were also tied to the agricultural cycle that reminds them of God's continual love for them through his provision. And these feasts also occurred during a downtime in the ag cycle. They were followed a harvest, so a whole lot less work had to be done during this time. And this allowed a time for the males to assemble and appear before God. And it also took away one's excuse for not being there. And these feasts are still observed by Jews today. So I think we'll stop there. We'll pick up this in verse 18 next time.